The black sedan pulled away from St. Catherine's Children's Home, leaving tire tracks in the December slush that would freeze before morning. Blake Morrison pressed his face against the cold window of the stranger's pickup truck, watching the only home he'd known for 8 years disappear into the Montana wilderness. At 17, he'd learned that survival meant keeping secrets, and the biggest one sat heavy in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. Beside him, his 13-year-old brother Connor fidgeted with the zipper on his worn jacket, eyes wide with the kind of nervous energy that came from too many changes. They'd been inseparable since the car accident that killed their parents when Blake was 9, moving through 4 foster homes together because Blake had made it clear from the start that separating them wasn't an option. The man driving barely spoke, just nodded when the social worker handed over their files and pointed toward the mountains. Robert Morrison, their grandfather, was a ghost from their father's side, someone who'd never sent birthday cards or Christmas presents, who'd never called after the funeral. Now, suddenly, he wanted them. The landscape outside grew more isolated with each mile, snow-covered pines stretching toward a sky the color of old pewter. Blake's stomach clenched not from the winding mountain roads, but from the secret that felt more dangerous with every mile they traveled into rural Montana. He was gay, had known it since he was 14, and had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility in a system that had no patience for complicated kids. The ranch appeared through the trees like something from a different century. A sprawling log house with smoke rising from the chimney and outbuildings scattered across the white fields. Behind everything, the Rocky Mountains stood like sentinels, beautiful and unforgiving. Robert Morrison climbed out of the truck slowly, as if his 68 years sat heavy on his shoulders, but his handshake was firm when he helped them with their bags. His few words came measured and careful, explaining the basic rules of ranch life, the chores that needed doing, the isolation that winter would bring. Blake studied the man's weathered face, looking for clues about who he really was, why he'd waited 80 years to claim them. There was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested layers beneath the surface, stories that hadn't been told. The house felt solid and warm, with thick wooden beams and windows that looked out over endless snow. Their rooms were simple but clean, each with a view of the mountains that made Blake feel simultaneously free and trapped. As Connor explored with the excitement of a kid who'd never lived anywhere this big, Blake stood at his window and wondered how long he could keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. That evening, as they sat around a dinner table that could have fed a dozen people, Robert asked few questions but listened carefully to their answers. Blake noticed the way the old man's eyes lingered on Connor's easy smile, the way his hands moved precisely when he cut his food, like someone accustomed to working with tools. There was a carefulness about him that suggested experience with things that could break if handled wrong. The first sign that Robert Morrison wasn't what he seemed came when Connor found the government agents. Blake was splitting wood behind the barn when Connor came running through the snow, with his face flushed from more than cold. Men in dark coats were parked on the road, watching the house through binoculars. Robert's reaction was swift and telling. His entire demeanor shifted from gentle grandfather to something harder, more alert. He moved to the front window with practiced efficiency, studying the sedan without exposing himself. When he turned back to the boys, his face carried gravity that made Blake's stomach drop. They were going to have to talk. Robert said, sooner than he'd planned. There were things about their family, about him, that weren't in any official records. Things that certain people preferred to keep buried, but that had a way of surfacing when least convenient. As darkness fell over the Montana ranch and the mysterious car finally drove away, Blake realized that keeping his own secrets might be the least of their problems. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones we keep, but the ones that keep us. The next morning brought harsh January sunlight that turned the snow into a blinding sheet of white, and with it, Blake's first day at Whitefish High School. Robert drove them down the mountain in silence, the pickup truck's heater fighting against the 20 below cold that made the windows fog with their breathing. Blake pressed his hands against his thighs to stop them from shaking, telling himself it was just the cold. Whitefish High sat like a brick fortress against the Montana sky, surrounded by pickup trucks and kids in heavy coats who looked like they'd been born knowing how to navigate ice and altitude. Blake pulled his foster system jacket tighter and followed Connor toward the main entrance, hyper-aware of how they stood out as the new kids, the orphans, the unknowns in a place where everyone had grown up together. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and adolescent anxiety, familiar scents that reminded Blake of every other school he'd attended. But something was different here in the mountain air, a kind of casual confidence in the way kids moved, like they belonged to something larger than themselves. Blake envied that certainty even as he knew he could never claim it. His first period chemistry teacher introduced him with forced enthusiasm that made everyone turn and stare, and Blake mumbled something about moving from Ohio while scanning the room for escape routes. That's when he saw Caleb Rivers sitting in the back row, and something inside Blake's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. Caleb had dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes the color of summer sky, but it was the way he listened when the teacher spoke, like he was genuinely interested in molecular structures, that made Blake look twice. When their eyes met accidentally, Caleb smiled. Just a quick lift of his lips that suggested kindness without expectation. Blake looked away fast, his heart hammering against his ribs. At lunch, Blake found himself sitting alone until Caleb appeared at his table with a tray and a question about whether he minded company. Blake shrugged, not trusting his voice, and listened while Caleb talked about growing up on a cattle ranch outside town, about brutal winters and brief, brilliant summers that made everyone forget how hard the cold could be. Blake learned that Caleb played guitar, helped his father with ranch work, and had never lived anywhere but Montana. There was something steady about him, like the mountains themselves, that made Blake want to stay in this conversation longer than was safe. When Caleb mentioned that his family had moved here from Colorado when he was small, Blake felt a flutter of connection, another transplant who'd had to learn new ground. After school, Robert was waiting into the parking lot, his weathered face unreadable behind the steering wheel. Blake climbed into the truck expecting questions about his day, but Robert drove them home in careful silence. Only when they reached the ranch did he speak, asking if Blake was settling in, if he'd met anyone worth knowing. Blake mumbled something about it being too early to tell, but he caught Robert studying him in the rearview mirror with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. There was something almost protective in that gaze, like Robert understood what it meant to carry secrets in a place where being different could be dangerous. That evening, after Connor had gone to bed exhausted from his own first day, Robert led Blake to a workshop behind the barn. Inside, workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and projects in various stages of completion. The air smelled like sawdust and metal shavings, honest scents that spoke of work done with hands instead of words. Robert moved through the space with practiced efficiency, showing Blake how to use a lathe, how to read technical drawings, how to measure twice and cut once. He explained that he'd been a NASA contractor for 30 years, designing components for spacecraft, solving problems that required precision down to thousands of inches. Some secrets, Robert said as he turned off the workshop lights, were worth protecting until you found people safe enough to share them with. The trick was learning to recognize safety when it appeared, and having the courage to reach for it when the time was right. 3 weeks into February, the Montana cold had settled into Blake's bones like something permanent, but so had the rhythm of his new life. School had become manageable. Ranch chores felt routine, and somewhere along the way, Caleb Rivers had become a constant presence at his lunch table, in his chemistry lab group, and increasingly, in his thoughts when he was supposed to be sleeping. The turning point came when Connor slipped on the ice outside the barn and came back to the house with his wrist bent at an angle that made Blake's stomach lurch. Robert drove them to the emergency clinic in town with steady calm, his grandfather's NASA training evident in the methodical way he handled unexpected problems. While Connor got x-rays and a bright blue cast, Blake found himself in the waiting room flipping through outdated magazines. When Caleb walked through the clinic doors carrying a guitar case and looking around with concern, Blake's heart did something complicated in his chest. Caleb had heard about the accident from his mother, who worked at the clinic as a nurse, and had driven into town to see if Blake needed anything. The simple kindness of the gesture left him speechless for longer than was probably normal. They sat together in uncomfortable plastic chairs, while Connor charmed the medical staff with his resilience, and Blake found himself talking about things he'd never planned to share. He told Caleb about the foster homes, about the careful way he'd learned to pack his belongings so they'd fit in a single bag, about never being certain where home would be next week. Caleb listened without trying to fix anything, occasionally asking questions that showed he was really hearing what Blake said. And slowly, carefully, Blake began to understand what Robert had meant about recognizing safety. When Connor emerged from the back with his cast, Robert's eyes moved between Blake and Caleb with the kind of assessment that suggested he was drawing conclusions. On the drive home, he mentioned casually that Caleb seemed like good people, the kind of friend worth having in a place where winters were long and neighbors mattered. That evening, while Connor dozed on the couch with his arm propped on pillows, Robert led Blake to a part of the workshop he'd never seen before. Behind a locked door was a smaller room lined with filing cabinets and covered in technical drawings that looked like they belonged in a NASA facility rather than a Montana ranch. The blueprints showed aircraft designs unlike anything Blake had ever seen, sleek vehicles that seemed to exist somewhere between science fiction and aerospace engineering. Robert moved through the room like someone revisiting a cathedral, his weathered hands touching the drawings with reverence. These were his life's work, he explained quietly. Designs for spacecraft that could operate in both atmospheric and vacuum conditions. The government had classified most of his research, buried it in bureaucratic archives, but he'd kept copies of everything, driven by the conviction that someday the technology might be needed. The real revelation came when Robert opened a wooden box on his workbench and withdrew a small framed photograph. The picture showed a younger Robert in military dress uniform, standing beside another man in civilian clothes, both of them squinting into bright sunlight with their arms around each other's shoulders. Robert's voice was steady when he spoke, but Blake could hear the weight of decades in his words. The man in the photograph was David Chen, a mathematician who'd worked with Robert on early space program calculations. They'd been partners in every sense, lovers and collaborators who dreamed of building vehicles that could carry humans to the stars. But the military had policies about people like them, and when their relationship was discovered, David had lost his security clearance, and Robert had been transferred to a different project. David had died in a car accident in 1972, just months before the government began quietly allowing gay men to work in sensitive positions. Robert had spent the next 30 years building their shared vision alone, pouring his grief and love into designs that would never see production, creating something beautiful as a monument to what they'd lost. Blake's throat felt tight as he processed the implications. Robert wasn't just sharing family history, he was offering acceptance and understanding. Love, Robert had said quietly, was too rare to waste on fear, too precious to sacrifice to other people's limitations. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the permission to be themselves completely, especially when the world has taught them to hide. March brought an early thaw that turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud and gave Blake the courage he'd been building toward all winter. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when he and Caleb were walking to the parking lot after school, their chemistry textbooks heavy in their backpacks and the conversation flowing easily between them. Caleb had been telling him about the guitar lessons he gave to middle school kids at the community center, and how one of them reminded him of how he'd been at that age, uncertain and searching for something to hold on to. Blake found himself studying Caleb's profile as he talked, the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned helping someone find their confidence. Without planning it, Blake heard himself saying that he knew what it felt like to be uncertain about who you were allowed to be. Caleb stopped walking and turned to face Blake with an expression that was patient and encouraging and completely without judgment. The words came out in a rush then, clumsy and honest and terrifying. Blake told him about the years of hiding, about the fear that had become automatic. He told Caleb that he was gay, that he'd been attracted to him since that first day in chemistry class, and that he understood if that changed things between them. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes serious and thoughtful. Then he said something that made Blake's heart stop and restart. He'd been hoping Blake would tell him because he'd been feeling the same way and hadn't known how to bring it up. He said that he'd actually known he was bisexual since sophomore year. What happened next was Blake's first kiss. Awkward and sweet and perfect in the way that moments are when they arrive exactly when they're needed. They stood in the muddy parking lot with the March wind cutting through their jackets, and Blake finally understood what Robert had meant about recognizing safety when it appeared. But safety wasn't something you could claim once and keep forever. It was something you had to defend, especially in places where being different made you a target. This trouble started the following week when Jake Mueller, a senior who'd made it clear he didn't approve of outsiders, saw Blake and Caleb holding hands near the lockers. Jake's reaction was swift and loud, his voice carrying across the hallway as he suggested that Whitefish didn't need any more freaks. Blake felt the familiar freeze response kick in, the automatic shutdown that had protected him through years of institutional care, but before he could disappear into invisibility. Caleb stepped forward with calmness that suggested he'd thought about this moment before. He told Jake that what he and Blake did was none of Jake's business. What surprised Blake was that the first person to speak up in their defense wasn't a student at all. Mrs. Patterson, the chemistry teacher, appeared from her classroom with the authority that comes from 30 years of managing teenagers. She informed Jake that harassment based on sexual orientation was against school policy. Over the next few days, Blake found his locker vandalized with slurs, his textbooks knocked from his hands. An anonymous note slipped into his backpack, suggesting he'd be better off back in foster care where freaks belonged. Robert noticed the change in Blake immediately, the way he'd retreated into careful politeness, the return of hypervigilance. When Robert asked directly what was happening at school, Blake tried to deflect, but his grandfather's steady gaze made dishonesty impossible. The conversation happened in the workshop. Robert listened without interruption as Blake described the harassment, the fear, the way it felt to have his identity used as a weapon against him. Finally, Robert spoke about David, about the way they'd been forced to hide their relationship, about the exhausting vigilance required to love someone when that love was considered dangerous. The next morning, Blake found Robert waiting for him in the truck, dressed in his best shirt and wearing an expression of quiet determination. They were going to school together because there were conversations that needed to happen with adults who had the authority to ensure Blake's safety. Blake was learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it, especially when you had people willing to stand with you. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to face our battles alone. June arrived in Montana with the kind of brilliant clarity that made the previous winter feel like something remembered from another lifetime. Blake stood in the workshop with Connor and Robert, all three covered in grease stains, staring at the culmination of months of work. The aircraft that had been Robert's secret passion project for decades was finally complete, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The past 3 months had transformed everything. Blake's relationship with Caleb had deepened into steady companionship that made daily life feel richer. Connor had grown 3 inches and developed the confidence that came from being genuinely valued. And Robert, despite the heart condition that had everyone concerned, had thrown himself into teaching them everything he knew about aerospace engineering. The government agents had returned twice more, but each time Robert had handled them with calm professionalism. The aircraft design was legally his, developed after retirement with his own resources. And while certain agencies might prefer to see the technology under federal control, they had no legal grounds to seize it. Blake had watched these interactions with fascination, seeing how Robert navigated bureaucratic pressure with the same precision he brought to mechanical problems. It was a masterclass in standing up for yourself while remaining professional, in refusing to be intimidated while never escalating unnecessarily. The real victory had come when Blake realized he was no longer afraid. Not of the government agents, not of the small-minded bullies at school, not even of the possibility that his new life might prove temporary. Robert had taught him that fear was a choice, that courage wasn't about the absence of anxiety, but about moving forward despite it. The test flight had been planned for weeks, but none of them had quite believed it would actually happen until this morning, when Robert fired up the engines and the aircraft responded with a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Blake's heart hammered as he watched his grandfather perform the final systems checks, methodical as always. Caleb had arrived early, bringing his father Tom Rivers for what might be the most unusual event in Whitefish history. Tom had listened to Robert's explanation of the aircraft's capabilities with respectful attention, understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The aircraft lifted off with surprising grace, rising smoothly into the Montana morning like something that had always belonged in the air. Blake held his breath as Robert guided it through gentle maneuvers, testing control systems and propulsion mechanisms that had existed only in blueprints for so many years. For 20 minutes, they watched Robert pilot the vehicle through increasingly complex patterns, demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exist somewhere between conventional aviation and science fiction. The aircraft moved with the fluidity that suggested the laws of physics were negotiable, powered by systems that generated thrust through electromagnetic principles. When Robert finally brought the aircraft down for a perfect landing, the silence that followed felt sacred. They'd just witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when dreams became reality through the application of knowledge, persistence, and the kind of love that expresses itself through creation rather than words. As they stood in the workshop celebrating with coffee and subdued excitement, Robert announced his decision about the aircraft. He'd spent weeks consulting with lawyers and aerospace industry contacts, and had decided to donate the vehicle to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The decision made perfect sense. The aircraft represented a breakthrough in propulsion technology that could benefit humanity, but it was too significant to remain hidden in a Montana workshop. By placing it in the Smithsonian, Robert ensured that the technology would be preserved, studied, and eventually developed. Blake found himself thinking about legacy, about the different ways people choose to be remembered. Robert could have sold the aircraft to the highest bidder. Instead, he'd chosen to give his life's work to the public, ensuring that the knowledge he and David had developed would serve the greater good. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become home, Blake reflected on how much had changed since that winter day when he'd first arrived in Montana, terrified of being discovered. But he was no longer afraid of those differences. Robert had taught him that authenticity was a form of courage. The lesson was simple but profound. What we build with courage becomes the foundation for others to build upon. Have you ever found family in the most unexpected places? Or discovered that your biggest vulnerability could become your greatest strength? Blake's journey reminds us that home isn't about where we come from, but about finding the courage to be ourselves with people brave enough to love us completely. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful journeys of truth, love, and belonging.